Jews funded, thank you. Jews funded, masterminded, and dominated the Atlantic slave trade. And it said Jews bore monumental culpability for all that slavery wrought. So the question is, what's real here? Okay, that was the charge. It's the Farrakhan anti-Semitism at its play, but that's the charge that was made. So let's look at going back to Europe first. All right, by the time Africans began to be exported to the Americas in any kind of significant numbers, right around 1570, Europe's leaders had already forced the overwhelming mass of Jewry eastward to Poland, to Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire. And then additionally, in a Europe that was intolerant of Jews, it's virtually impossible for Jews to hold any kind of managerial position. So the whole thing doesn't make sense. And lastly, at no point in the continuum of the slave trade were Jews numerous enough, rich enough, or powerful enough to effectively change anything about the flow and structure of the slave trade. So none of it really makes sense, such a kind of charge. And even here in America, a report to the 1853 meeting of the leading anti-slavery society accurately described Jewish activities, and that's reading number 1. So let's see, Marcia, you have the first square. You're square number 1.
Okay, the Jews of the United States have never taken any steps whatsoever with regard to the slavery question. As citizens, they deem it their policy, quote, to have everyone choose whichever side he may deem best to promote his own interests and the welfare of his country. Is that end quote? Maybe, I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. The objects of so much prejudice and unrighteous oppression is the Jews have been for ages, surely.
It should have been as the Jews have.
Oh, okay. Oppression, as the Jews have been for ages, surely they, it would seem, more than any other denomination, ought to be the enemies of caste and friends of universal freedom.
Okay. Basically, it's saying that we've suffered a lot. It doesn't make sense. And the reality of it is we didn't, as a people, take sides because there was this fear of an anti-Semitic backlash. And so we became very politically conservative in America and detached from any kind of controversial causes outside the scope of Judaism. All right. So let's look at the Jewish experience in the South, and then we'll travel north and look at the experience there. Most of the Jews who lived in America at this point arrived over the decade and a half prior to the Civil War. All right. In 1848, there were about 50,000 Jews in America. By 1860, it was 150,000. And 1877, following the war, the number reached 270,000. So there's a huge influx between 1848 and 1877, mostly of German immigration. These immigrants were primarily young Jewish men. They were neither the poorest because they couldn't afford to come, or the wealthiest because they had a good life and had no reason to come. So they were neither the poorest or the wealthiest of the populations that they left behind in Europe. They were, however, highly motivated to fit in and to follow the ways of the land. It would seem to be realistic to conclude that any Jew in the South who could afford to own slaves and had a need for their services, just like everyone around them would have. Jewish owners of slaves were not the exception. They were the rule, just like everybody else. Slavery was an axiomatic foundation of the social pattern of the Old South. So those Jews living there found ways to acclimate themselves in every way in the environment, in both social and psychological ways, and they needed to be accepted as their equals. They weren't going to cause stirs. So it was therefore only a matter of financial circumstance and familial status as to whether or not they would become slave owners in the South. The behavior of the Jews towards their slaves and slavery in general seems to have been indistinguishable from the non-Jewish world. That's really important. All right. Southern Jews were more likely to follow the 3rd century Talmudic maxim that the law of the land is the law for Jews, and therefore to regard the institution of slavery as part of the law that they were bound to uphold and follow. That would be predominant over the prophetic message of the failings of slavery, because that's what was around them. All right, I know that.
Question.
Go ahead, Marcia.
But technically, that was not the law of the land, right? It wasn't a law of the land. It was
The law of the land was to allow it.
Was to allow it, but not compel it, right?
Right. It was right. That's correct. But it was the ways of the people.
It was
around
the
them.
ways of the people.
Right.
Okay.
That's a fair distinction. No Jewish political figure in the Old South expressed any reservation about the justice of slavery or the rightness of the Southern position. That's among the Jewish political world. Judah Benjamin, a name we'll talk a little bit about him later if I have the time, a senator from Louisiana, upheld the morality and the legality of the institution of slavery in the halls of Congress. Benjamin had served at different times as the Confederacy's Attorney General, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State. Now, he was intermarried. He'd had a lack of personal religious observance, but he always nonetheless observed and acknowledged his Judaism, and it was known publicly that he was a Jew. There was no denying he was a Jew. He just wasn't necessarily connected to Jewish practice. Benjamin's passion for the Confederate cause and his wise counsel to President Jefferson Davis was invaluable during the war. He became one of Davis's major leaders. But nonetheless, anti-war Jewish sentiment aimed at him from all of the South nonetheless existed, despite the fact that he was a major contributor. And when the cause was going down to defeat, you can imagine who they blamed for the loss within the South. It was the Jews' fault, right? And Benjamin's in particular. Benjamin ultimately needs to resettle in England, where he becomes a highly respected lawyer. The small number of Jews in the South also mitted against any kind of creation of a distinctively Jewish approach to this question. Jews were a small fragment of the Southern population, and key fact here is they were thinly distributed. They weren't located in, like we have a shtetl in Ireland. This wasn't how they lived there, okay? They were thinly distributed throughout, and so it's entirely likely that they would derive their opinions from their discussions with their non-Jewish neighbors, rather than Jewish friends in particular. Their influences were the larger society. And so the truth of the matter is that the history of slavery in the South would not have differed one iota from the reality if there had not been a single Jew in the land. Okay. Thoughts, comments? Okay. Let's go north. All right, we journey north. The Jews of the North, the great majority of the Jewish community, were generally opposed to slavery and contributed some workers to the abolitionist cause. But it's not that simple, because the abolitionist movement drew motivation and inspiration from the evangelical Protestant convictions. And this was a group that sought the conversion of the Jews to Christianity through active missionizing. And as a result, within the abolitionists, there was a strong anti-Jewish animus that surfaced. Okay. In the writings of William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most prominent of the abolitionists, we find reading number 2. And David, I've got you in square number 2, so you get number 2.
Okay. Oh, the rottenness of Christendom, Judaism, and Romanism are the leading features of Protestantism. I am forced to believe that as it respects the greater portion of professing Christians in the land, Christ has died in vain. In their traditions, their forms and ceremonies, their vain janglings, their self-righteousness, their will worship, their sectarian zeal and devotion, their infallibility and exclusiveness. They are Pharisees and Sadducees. They are Papists and Jews.
Catholics and Jews. All right. So there wasn't a place, even among the abolitionists, it was difficult for the Jews to fit in because they weren't accepted. And the Jews in response reciprocated the suspicion and disfavor, as you can imagine. A number of rabbis, even those who opposed slavery, considered abolitionists to be reckless agitators and warmongering Christian zealots. Historians are therefore not terribly surprised that few Jews joined the ranks of the abolitionists. It doesn't mean they weren't pro-slavery, but they weren't willing to join the abolitionist cause. And it explains why there even was some sentiment among Jews to settle and move south. Okay. Comments on the general statements of the North?
How many, was there a fair amount of Jews in the shipping trade?
Yeah, I'm sure they did. Yeah, the answer is yes. The wealthy Jews in Holland, the wealthy Jews really from South America, et cetera, where a lot of this was being conducted, were part of shipping in general. Yes. Now, who was responsible for who got on what ship was probably more captain determined because they made money off of it. They were shipping goods and could make extra money by sticking extra people into the cargo.
Right. I think that that's where the Farrakhan and the Muslims get some fuel in that.
Yep.
Jews in the shipping were involved in the cotton trade.
Right. That is possible. But again, you're talking about small numbers, and most of the European countries would not allow Jews to be involved in the industries in general, but there were some. Yeah.
But weren't in the islands, because it was the cotton rum,
They were in some cases they were the intermediaries on the islands. That's correct.
And that was the connection to New Orleans too.
Right.
At least according to like historical novels I read.
That's
there was
correct.
a connection through New Orleans to the Jews there through the islands.
Right.
They settled in New Orleans also.
Yep.
So Cantor, maybe I'm missing something from the prior talks, not remembering. But when you started off in those Jews who left Recife in the 1600s?
1654.
Yeah, and the Jewish community established themselves in the Northeast reasonably well.
Right.
How did they grow in sufficient numbers? And then how does that fit in with, the fact that the abolitionists in the North, they were blaming the Jews? How did that occur?
Right. They also settled in the South in Savannah.
Right.
And other communities. So they were scattered around, Again, most of the growth happened from 1848 on. You only had 50,000 Jews in the entire country before 1848. And you're talking about almost 300,000 15, 20 years later. All right. So most of it is, yes, there's some growth, but most of it is new movement of Jews coming from Europe. When you talk, it's not internal growth.
Was that after the Civil War?
No, about half of it occurred before the Civil War, and half of it occurred in the first 15 years of the Civil War itself. In those years, the 15 years that followed. All right, so I think it doubled before the Civil War, so it was up to about 100,000, if I remember the number correctly.
So they were still thinly distributed, and therefore the bane of everybody's life.
That's correct. That's correct. And easy to identify because you don't know anybody. Half the people never met any Jews. So it's easy to, you're operating on Christian lore and Christian traditions of the Jews are trickery. All right. All right. So I want to look at the different response between both the Orthodox and the Reform. Again, there's no conservative Judaism at this point. It doesn't even come into existence for another 40, 50 years, except for the Orthodox rabbi by the name of Sabbato Marias of Philadelphia. There were virtually, in terms of speaking up, no Orthodox Jews in the anti-slavery movement. Rabbi Morris Jacob Rafal, who we'll read about in just a few minutes, an Orthodox rabbi, accused the abolitionists of being impulsive disclaimers, gifted with great zeal, but little knowledge, more eloquent than learned. And he accused the abolitionist preachers of perverting the meaning of the Bible. He went so far as to say that slaveholding was no sin, for slave property was expressly placed under the protection of the 10 commandments. If you go into the 4th commandment, it talks about giving your slaves time off for Shabbat. So therefore, it's an accepted practice. He is making the statement the Bible endorses slavery. However, the German Reform rabbis and the Reform Jews became avowed abolitionists, given the fact that the problems that the Reform Judaism faced in general in the mid-19th century. Rabbi David Einhorn was an abolitionist and one of the founders of the German and American Reform Judaism, and he believed that there was a fundamental relationship between the rights of Jews and the rights of Blacks, because there could be no freedom for minorities in an atmosphere of enslavement. So one of his arguments is it's not biblical. He's not arguing the Bible, he's arguing the morality. And he says innate inferiority arguments were dangerous because they could be employed against any minority group for any reason and for future oppression. He sums up the new creed when he says that Reform Judaism believes the following. They believe in one humanity, all of whose members, being of the same heavenly and earthly origin, possess alike a nobility of birth and a claim to equal rights, equal laws, and an equal share of happiness.
Mhm.
All right.
So it seems as if he's going back to the Declaration of Independence
Yes,
and American values about happiness and rights and natural rights.
that's correct. Rights as opposed to obligations. Right.
Yeah.
Judaism generally talks about obligations. The Constitution talks about rights. All right, they're distinct. Michael Halpern, another Reform rabbi, attacks the views of Rabbi Rafal, the Orthodox rabbi, on several levels. He argues, now he's taking on the biblical argument. He argues that the pro-slavery rabbi had mistranslated the biblical word eved, which we translate as a slave, which should, he says, been rendered servant or bondsman. And his proof of that is if you look at the liturgy, all right, right after the Kedusha on Shabbat, every single week we say, Yismach Moshe b'matnat chelko ki eved ne'eman karata lo, that Moses was happy with his portion because he was considered a faithful eved to God. No one translates eved there as a slave. All right. On the other hand, we all do, when we sing Avadim Hayinu, what are we saying? We were slaves. So he's saying the whole thing is a mistranslation, and therefore you can't use the biblical argument in support of slavery.
Was ever any argument ever used that the slavery in the United States had no real similarity to biblical slavery, where you had the Jubilee year, where the Jubilee year would come up and they would
would be freed. All right, but let me distinguish here for you in terms of the biblical understanding of those slaves. The Jubilee year would come and Jewish slaves were freed. Jews who had been sold into slavery because of a crime or because they couldn't pay a debt that they owed, and they were therefore working off that debt through this slavery. Now, the conditions of a Jewish slave were different. Let me not suggest otherwise. There were limitations on what you could do with a slave. You couldn't beat him. You couldn't make him work more than 8 hours a day, kind of thing. There were limitations. So it's not an identical slavery under the best of conditions. Okay, but the concept of slavery, what the word eved means, is certainly up for debate in how it's used, and it's used many different ways as the answer in reality. In certain points, it is used as a slave, and in certain points, it's used as a servant. And so therefore, quoting it in the Ten Commandments is not an absolute statement of what its real meaning is. Okay, so that's Michael Halpern's approach. And so the result is this really this goes beyond just the slavery issue. This is an argument on how do we translate and understand the Bible. Orthodoxy says it's a traditional, literal interpretation. Reform Judaism says, no, we have to bring a critical, liberal spirit to our understanding of the text and look at how the words might have been used differently. So you've got something that's going on here that's beyond slavery, and that's interpreting the Bible. And that's a distinction between the movements. One of America's foremost rabbis, the Reform leader, Isaac Meyer Wise, who you may have heard of in Cincinnati, takes a middle of the road stance, siding with the peace Democrats. He feared that the abolitionists, quote, were fanatics opposed to immigration and Jews alike. We've talked about they were evangelicals. And most important, Wise felt that the status quo, the live and let live policy, had been good for the Jews. Just leave it alone. Let's not cause controversy. Jews don't do well in societies where there's controversy. Historically, that is the case. We do best when things are calm. All right. With that in mind, I want to, rather than taking my word for it, I want to, readings 3 and 4 are long. They are the words of Rabbi Morris Rafal, the Orthodox rabbi, and then you have the response of Einhorn, the Reform rabbi. And I want you to see their words directly rather than taking my interpretations of such. All right, so let's see. Eric, you have reading number 3, but let's split it up. Eric and Amy, if you'll split it about halfway through. And then Rona and Bill, if you'll split reading number 4. We have 9 readings, so Martin, I promise we'll get to you.
I don't have them.
Okay. All right. So Eric and Amy, you've got reading number 3. Somewhere along the way, just split it.
All right. On December 14th, 1860, President James Buchanan issued a proclamation calling on the people of the United States to observe a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer throughout the Union in view of the present distracted and dangerous condition of our country. To honor Buchanan's proclamation, Rabbi Morris J. Rafal delivered this address to his current congregation in New York. Just FYI, that was actually B'nai Jeshurun.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. If they truly and honestly desire to save our country, let them believe in God and in his holy word. And then when the authority of the Constitution is to be set aside for a higher law, they will be able to appeal to the highest law of all, the revealed law and word of God, which afforded supreme sanction to the Constitution. There can be no doubt, my friends, that however much of personal ambition, selfishness, pride, and obstinance there may enter into the present unhappy quarrel between the two great sections of the Commonwealth, I say it is certain that the origin of the quarrel itself is the difference of opinion respecting slaveholding, which the one section denounces as sinful, as the most heinous of sins, while the other section upholds it as perfectly lawful. It is the province of statesmen to examine the circumstances under which the Constitution of the United States recognizes the legality of slaveholding, and under what circumstances, if any, it becomes a crime against the law of the land. But the question whether slaveholding is a sin before God is one that belongs to the theologian. I've been requested by prominent citizens of other denominations that I should on this day examine the Bible's view of slavery, as the religious mind of the country requires to be enlightened on the subject. Well, you want me to continue?
Yeah, go another paragraph or so, yeah.
Okay. The subject of my investigation falls into 3 parts. First, how far back can we trace the existence of slavery? Secondly, is slaveholding condemned as a sin in sacred scripture? Thirdly, what was the condition of the slave in biblical times and among the Hebrews?
Okay, Amy, why don't you come on?
slaveholding condemned as a sin. How this question can at all arise in the mind of any man that has received a religious education and is acquainted with the history of the Bible is a phenomenon I cannot explain to myself, and which 50 years ago no man dreamed of. But we live in times when we must not be surprised at anything. Receiving slavery as one of the conditions of society, the New Testament nowhere interferes with or contradicts the slave code of Moses. It even preserves a letter written by one of the most eminent Christian teachers to a slave owner on sending back to him his runaway slave. And when we refer to the history and requirements of our own sacred scriptures, we find that on most solemn occasion therein recorded when God gave the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Slaveholding is not only recognized and sanctioned as an integral part of the social structure, but the property in slaves is placed under the same protection as any other species of lawful property. When it is said, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house or his fields or his male slave or his female slave or his ox or his ass or aught that belong to thy neighbor. When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, all these men were slaveholders, does it not strike you that you are guilty of something very short of blasphemy? My friends, I find, and I am sorry to find, that I am delivering a pro-slavery discourse. I am no friend to slavery in the abstract, and still less friendly to the practical working of slavery. But I stand here as a teacher in Israel, not to place before you my own feelings and opinions, but to propound to you the word of God, the biblical view of slavery. 1, concerning the condition of the slave in biblical times and among the Hebrews. The slave is a person in whom the dignity of human nature is to be respected. He has rights, whereas the heathen view of slavery, which prevailed at Rome and which I'm sorry to say is adopted in the South, reduces the slave to a thing, and a thing can have no rights. The result to which the biblical view of slavery leads us is 1, that slavery has existed since the earliest time. 2, that slaveholding is no sin, and that slave property exists expressly placed under the protection of the 10 Commandments. 3, that the slave is a person and has rights, not conflicting with the lawful exercise of rights of his owner.
Okay, I want to just stop there and hear thoughts.
Highly contradictory.
Yes.
Why?
On the one hand, he's proposing that he's a pro-slaver, and then he's saying that a slave is a person and has rights, whereas, you know, in the South, or where there was slavery in the US, they were things. So how can you be pro-slavery when you say people have rights, but they're things?
He's making a distinction between the slaves of the Bible and the slaves of the heathens in the South. He is making that distinction there, okay? And he's saying in the Bible, the slaves were treated as human beings and had rights.
Right.
Right. He is saying
so, but if he's taking that stance, how can you switch and say, well, I'm okay with slavery in the South, and they're treated as things?
No. He's conflicted. He's conflicted between the stance he must take as a scholar and his view of slavery as it exists in the South.
But
I think you see that conflict right here.
But he also is conflicted even when you go back to where he's saying about the Bible, because he's quoting that it's property. The slave is property.
right.
So, and then later he's saying also that the Bible gives them rights, but he's not specific to what rights. What rights?
No, but
I would love to know what rights he's saying.
But he says, I am no friend to slavery in the abstract, and still less friendly to the practical working of slavery. I mean, he, he's this, this is,
So you see the
in some sense,
complexity.
it's a torch. It's sort of a tortured opinion, really.
Right. I
Yeah.
think that's a great response. Yeah, but you see the complexity here.
It's very,
not-
very. it's very-
Like most things in life, nothing is, if you're looking for precedent, you're looking for law. Before the issue arises, you're not going to find it. That's how law gets written, is when you have these complexities.
Well, I
Alright.
would say also within number, if you just look within his point number 3, that the slave is a person and has rights, not conflicting with the lawful exercise of the rights of his owner. In the South, what does lawful exercise of the rights of his owner mean? They were doing whatever they wanted, and there weren't codes written up about you can do this, you can't do that. It doesn't work.
Right.
That's why he calls it the result to its biblical view of slavery leads us.
Right.
And he's focused on the biblical view.
Mhm.
I think he was being very diplomatic. So he whatever he thought of slavery himself, I think he was afraid of a backlash if he
Okay.
came out too strongly against slavery.
So let's look at what Rabbi David Einhorn, because this is what he is now going to respond to what we've just read. Okay, let's hear what he has to say and go from there. So Rona, you've got the first hand and the half, and Bill, you've got the second half.
All right. So this is not the first time we have had occasion to admire the originality of Dr. Raphael. But we never would have given him credit for the originality displayed in the sermon which he delivered on January 4th and published in the New York Herald, and in which he claims for the institution of slavery the sanction of the Bible in language the most positive and decided. The question restricts itself exclusively to this: is the institution of slavery per se a moral evil, or is it not? And here it is that Dr. Raphael earns for himself the sorry reputation of declaring on the authority of divine law the legitimacy and moral rectitude of slavery, and inveighed sharply against Christian ministers who happen to differ from him, a Jew, the offspring of a race which daily praises God for deliverance from the bondage of Egypt, and whose fellow believers are to this hour groaning. Am I in the right one?
Yep.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
Yep.
I am, okay, because I had to turn the page.
You are right.
Okay, this groaning under the heavy yoke of slavery, in which most of the cities of the old world, and crying to the Almighty for help, undertakes to parade slavery as a perfectly sinless institution sanctioned by God, and to confront those presumptuous people who will not believe it with somewhat of an air of moral indignation.
That's a long sentence.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry. Very long. A more extraordinary phenomenon could hardly be imagined. But when the speaker, in the midst of his oratorical effort, becomes himself aware of the grandeur of his undertaking, and from the bosom of overflowing with loving kindness, the following words escaped his lips: I find, and I am sorry to find, that I am delivering a pro-slavery discourse, but I stand here and propound to you the word of God. Then surely the crown of martyrdom must have descended upon his head, had not the black skull cap at the time covered the enviable spot. Okay,
All right.
I can keep going for another paragraph.
One more paragraph. Go ahead.
Yeah. In the history of creation, of which our pious speaker engages in his own creative efforts, takes not the least notice, we read, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. This passage at least is devoid of any information respecting dominion over Negroes, excepted it be assumed that the latter are included in the class of animals that creep upon the earth.
Okay, Bill?
The Jew is conservative from principle and intensely so in a land which in spiritual and material blessings offers to him everything that he can desire. He wishes for peace almost at any price and trembles perhaps more than any other for the perpetuation of the union, like a son for the life of his mother, sick unto death. I also share your patriotic sentiments with my full heart, and I join you in the fervent supplication that God may answer right speedily our prayers for peace. But whatever party we may follow, we are not permitted to let the sanctuary of our religion be dragged into the political arena and made subservient to the interests of this or that party, as has been attempted with such publicity and from his consecrated place in the instance stated above. The immaculate virtue of Mosaic principles has been our pride and our boast and our weapon these thousands of years. This weapon we cannot yield without supplying our enemies with formidable means of attack. This pride and this boast we dare not and will not suffer to be taken from us. It was unpardonable, the greatest triumph of our opponents and our certain destruction, to dearly exchange to the unstable and evanescent favors of the moment. Might it not be said, and with justice, as it has already been said in reference to the lamentable event which has called forth this disclaimer? Look at these Jews. There, where they are oppressed, they cannot find words enough to boast of the humanity of their religion. But when they are free, their preachers pronounce on the authority of that solemn and most holy occasion on Sinai, the divine sanction of slavery, while Christian ministers in the South and in the presence of the representatives of the people advised moderation, sometimes openly deprecate or plead the forces of circumstances in extenuating of the established institution. I am not a politician and have nothing to do with politics, but to proclaim in the name of Judaism that God has consecrated the institution of slavery. Such a shame and reproach the Jewish religious press is in duty bound to disown and disavow, if both are not to be stigmatized forever.
Okay, thoughts and responses?
He's saying that the desire of the Orthodox rabbi, he really wants the union to stay as one because those are times of peace. This is going back to what you said about in times of war that Jews are stigmatized. So Einhorn, I think, is implying that that was of undue influence on the Orthodox rabbi's statement.
Mm-hmm. And he's then going and saying one step further is, by the way, when you do this in a world in which the Christian ministers are saying this is an evil, it's a chilul Hashem. It's an embarrassment to God.
Yeah, yeah.
It's also first mentioned in all of this about the Negroes being a class of animals versus people.
I don't think he means it in that way. I think when he says animals, he's talking about humanity being animals. I think. I could be mistaken.
Well, it says, this passage, at least this is devoid of any information respecting dominion over Negroes, except that it is assumed that the later are included in the class of animals.
You're right. You're right.
But that would have been the opinion of many people in the South.
That's
Yes.
right.
Right.
So he's saying that, this is wrong. They're not animals. They're part of humanity. They were humans were created at the same time, no matter what they looked like.
That's
At
right.
least that's the way I'm reading it.
That's right. And that's what's causing the controversy,
All
is
right.
because they were never thought of as people.
Right. So what you're seeing here between the two rabbis is really reflective of the American Jewish population. They weren't necessarily on either side of this issue. They were torn between cherished principles and the compromise for the sake of union and stability and peace. It was really torn, and you see the great majority of rabbis avoided any comments at all from the Bema on this issue. And oftentimes when they did say something, they were fired.
Well, that happened later and in the civil rights movement too, in the
Yes,
South. There
that's
were many
correct.
rabbis who wouldn't take a position because they would have been fired.
By the way, it's in the North too.
Well,
They
yeah,
would have been fired
Yeah.
for taking positions.
yeah. So,
Okay. So it was you see very little commentary. These are two that I found that are really clear on where they stand. All right. You have
Yeah.
thousands of Jews who volunteered, and many died on both sides of the conflict. An estimate places the number in the Union forces at about 8,500, and in the Confederate forces at about 10,000. Other estimates differ, but it's clear that Jews fought on both sides in numbers much greater than their percentages in the general population. They went to war. They fought for what they believed in. There were 9 Jewish generals in the North. We don't know the number in the South, but we know that it's several. Jews fought not only for their respective causes, but in process were often forced to fight for equal rights for themselves in this discussion, okay? 6 Jewish soldiers in the Union Army received the Congressional Medal of Honor in this process. All right, so we have real records of Jews taking this very seriously in their battles. I'm going to stop on that topic right there and go to it's also Civil War, but a sort of shift in tone. Okay, any comments, thoughts? We're good?
it just, I remember as a kid when we were told about Judah P. Benjamin, we were not told all this negative, that
Right.
it was like, oh, well, he really didn't believe in the South. They smoothed over it because no one wanted to believe that Jews could think that way.
Yeah, in the same way, look, how many, we talked about this in the class in anti-Semitism when I taught last year, how many people really know about Shabbatai Tzvi? The rabbis have clearly tried to downplay it and take it off the page. It's not something we're proud of. Right? And so this is not necessarily our proudest moment if you look back reflectively. And so we don't talk a lot about the negatives that go with it. All right. In the North, 2 events galvanized the Jewish community during the war: the issue of Jewish chaplaincy and the issue of Ulysses S. Grant's Order Number 11. All right, so I want to look at the two. First, let's look at chaplaincy. The American tradition of military chaplaincy is as old as America itself. Clergymen served in the armies of the individual colonies for the Revolutionary War, and provisions were already being made for the payment of chaplains by the Continental Congress as early as 1775. So we know they existed. We know they were paid. These chaplains were all Protestants, though of varying denominations. Just to start out with, the possibility of a Roman Catholic chaplain received no official attention until the Mexican War. And there, President Polk suggested that the bishops appoint 2 priests to serve with the armies in a civilian capacity, but he had no intention of recommending them for military appointments. Catholic priests served military posts, but their official status was totally open to question. It isn't until the Civil War that any real discussion opens about opening this opportunity for Catholics. Okay. It's also no discussion about it until the Civil War for Jews. So it's really about being Protestant. It wasn't an attack on Jews. It was outside anything other than you're either a Protestant or you're not.
It was actually the first time you had a substantial Catholic population in the United States with the new Irish immigrants.
That's right. Same time the Jews are starting to come, the Irish are starting to come, and you're finding the same thing. Thank you, Eric. Exactly. Once the conflict begins, and there are thousands of Jews now enlisted, as we talked about, in the armies of both the Confederacy and the North, it was inevitable that some Jews were going to start to say, I want a Jewish chaplain. I want someone who I can relate to. And what you've got here is the personal liberties and civil rights of members of all religious minorities have been safeguarded by the Constitution. And this becomes one of the tests of that statement. In the Confederacy, because they're not bound by the Constitution, where it specifically says Protestant, the equality was apparently recognized immediately upon the outbreak of the war, and there were Jewish chaplains in the South. No legal barrier existed to such an appointment. In the North, however, the original volunteer bill, as reported to the floor of the House of Representatives, required that, quote, regimental chaplains who were to be appointed by the regimental commander on the vote of the field officers and company commanders present the regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination. Okay, members of the House failed to be moved by and rejected the amendment and passed a bill with this clause intact. So at the beginning of the war, the Civil War, they maintained Jews could not serve in this capacity. September of 1861, 3 months after that the bill passed as I just described it, a YMCA worker happened to visit a military camp in Virginia, popularly known as Cameron's Dragons. And he's horrified. He discovers that there is a Jew, Michael Allen of Philadelphia, serving as the regimental chaplain, and he begins an agitation in the public press that ultimately the assistant adjunct general of the Army, George Ruggles, is forced to say in writing, because of this response, that any person mustered into service as a chaplain and not a regularly ordained clergyman of a Christian denomination will at once be discharged without pay or allowance. Allen, the Jew who is serving this capacity, is so humiliated that he resigns his commission on the excuse of being ill rather than suffer any dishonor of dismissal from the service. Nonetheless, this makes it public. It is now a public issue. And in response, the Board of Delegates of American Israelites began to press for the appointment of Jewish chaplains. It's now become a cause, because now there's a name to it. It's not just a generic situation. Rabbi Arnold Fischel of New York Sheriff Israel is delegated to investigate the conditions, and writing to the board, the Jewish board, he says, reading number 5, I think we're back to you, Marcia.
Okay. Now that I have visited all the hospitals in Virginia, I have a distinct idea of what has to be done and what can be done. The number of Jews in the Army is very large. As a general rule, they are not known as Jews, but hundreds with whom I have conversed express their anxiety and hope that some provision may be made for them, so that in case of sickness or death, they may not be left to the mercy of strangers. Since they entered hospitals, they have, in addition to the sufferings of disease, to submit to the torture of religious controversy forced upon them by Christian clergymen who are anxious to save their souls.
Okay. The public release of this letter led to outcries all over the place. The good news is, by July of 1862, the US Congress voted to change the words in the law pertaining to the appointment of military chaplains from Christian denomination to religious denomination, leading to the appointment of Rabbi Fischel as the first Jewish chaplain, 1862. All right, so that's the first thing that came out of this. General Order number 11. Let me talk about this a little bit. Caesar, I'm going to give you some background here. Caesar Caskell moved to Paducah, Kentucky in 1858, imagining that he had found the economic opportunity he'd been looking for. This newly incorporated city, located on the Ohio River below the mouth of the Tennessee River and about 50 miles up from the Mississippi, was booming. He made timely investments and excellent rail connections, and there's a growing volume of trade. he and his business partner, Solomon Greenbaum, just in case you weren't sure they were Jewish, all right, looked to participate in this growth, and they set up a business in Paducah, Kentucky. The Civil War disrupted that economic life and changed Catskill's life for the worse. The North began restricting trade in Paducah as early as 1861 June, seeking to place economic pressures on the Confederacy. And on September 6 of 1861, Grant and his troops captured and occupied the city, further restricting any trade with the South. Right? That's the scenario. The state of Kentucky itself declares itself neutral in the war. But Grant believes, and probably correctly so, that the majority of the citizens of Paducah would have preferred the presence of the Southern Army. Be that as it may, at least some of the 30-odd Jews in the city supported the North. Catskill was one of them, and his brother Julius operated as a recruiter for the Union Army. When you've got this kind of chaos going on, what happens? You've got bountiful opportunities for speculators and smugglers who find a way to profit from wartime shortages and imbalances. And that starts to happen. While merchants like Catskill were demonstrating their union credentials in hopes of obtaining trade permits, there were many, many officials in government trade and who found backhanded ways to line their own pockets, as did many of the soldiers. And in short order, because of that, there's this public corruption, there's recognition of public corruption, and mutual trust declines and recrimination abounds. And you know in that setting who is going to be blamed. It is the Jew. It's the long stereotyped Jew in Christian culture as being financially unscrupulous. So whether or not they were involved didn't matter. Jews become the focus of much of the hatred and the mistrust of the war as it's unleashed in the city. And even though they're really very few in Paducah, they're very unsubstantial in numbers, they play an outside role in the business trade, and they're marked by their European actions. They're just identified by their European traditions. Unionists, Confederates alike distrust and doubt the loyalty of the Jews, because the Jews are known for being on both sides of the argument. They're sitting on the fence. How can you trust anybody who sits on the fence? Shortly after this, and it comes as a surprise to the Jewish community, on December 17, 1862, Grant orders General Order number 11, expelling all Jews as a class in the territory controlled by his army, including the states of Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. It's one of the most odious and confounding documents in all of American history. You've got reading number 6 here. All right. So Eric, I don't see David. Eric, you've got this one.
Okay. The Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Tennessee Department and also department orders are hereby expelled from the department. Within 24 hours from the receipt of this order by post commanders, they will see that all of this class of people are furnished with passes and required to leave. And anyone returning after such notification will be arrested and held in confinement until an opportunity occurs of sending them out as prisoners, unless furnished with permits from their headquarters. No passes will be given these people to visit headquarters for the purpose of making personal application for trade.
Okay. The response of the Jewish community is immediate and furious. There are parents of soldiers fighting in the Union Army, and they join leaders in mass protests and petitions. The New York Times refers to the order as one of the deepest sensations of the war, and American Jews protest by sending letters and telegrams to Washington. Catskill appeals to the highest governmental power possible and he sets up he travels to Washington and he meets with President Lincoln, who immediately rescinds the order. The president had no knowledge of the order in advance, for it had not reached Washington. And in an often quoted report, he resorts to biblical imagery in his interview with Caskill, a reminder of how 19th century Americans linked Jews to ancient Israel and America to the promised land. You have reading number 7, very brief. Amy, if you would read this. This is a theoretical dialogue. You need, Amy, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. Lincoln, and so the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan. Haskell, yes, and that is why we have come under Father Abraham's bosom asking protection. Lincoln, and this protection they shall have at once.
Now, it's likely this is made up. It's not probably a real conversation. But what we do know is that Lincoln instantly did command the general-in-chief of the army, Henry Halleck, to countermand the orders. And that's reading number 8. Rona, if you would just do reading number 8 there.
Okay, War Department, Washington, January 4th, 1863. Major General Grant, a paper purporting to be General Orders number 11, issued by you December 17th, has been presented here. By its terms, it expels all Jews from your department. If such an order has been issued, it will be immediately revoked. H.W. Halleck, General-in-Chief.
All right. So obviously it doesn't take effect, but it stands. We know of this order. And the question, there's a lot of questions about this, and we don't really have answers. After the war, in 1868, Grant runs for president, and a lot of the Jewish community is dead set against him for obvious reasons, as it appears. He is humiliated by this whole process. We don't know exactly what motivated him to do it, but he goes out of his way to make it clear that he doesn't believe he's an anti-Semite, and he has more Jews in his cabinet and in his surrounding people than any president had ever had at that time. And so he clearly either has had a change of heart, or something else led to whatever happened with the general order number 11. We don't know exactly. I've heard several lectures on trying to figure out what the heck was going through Grant's mind, and it's all over the place in those lectures. All right, that gives you a little bit of a sense of Jews' stand on the Civil War, that they basically reflected the people amongst whom they lived, the values of the people amongst whom they lived. They were trying to avoid any sense of chaos, because Jews don't do well in chaos. And at the same time, even looking to biblical texts, there can sometimes be confusion. There can be, oftentimes you'll see, even in today's world, liberals will look towards a general principle of the Bible, such as slavery. And the traditionalists will find a verse or a couple of verses that say, wait a minute, time out. That's not what the Bible says. That's what you saw in the slavery issue. All right. Is it an overriding principle? Is it a verse where it's very direct? What drives? And the answer is sometimes they're conflicting. Sometimes it's conflicting information, and it's hard to say who's right when you just turn to the Bible for an absolute answer. That's why there was a need for Mishnah and Talmud. What does the Bible say? We as Jews are rabbinic Jews, not biblical Jews. We understand the Bible through the lens of rabbinic interpretation. We don't see lo tifashel gedi b'chalevi mo, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk in a literal sense. We see it through the rabbinic lens of don't eat milk and meat together, even though that's not what it says directly. All right. So the document by itself requires interpretation, and that's why there's these kinds of disagreements. All right. That's where I'm going to leave us for today. We'll continue next time with the post-war period and go from there. That is not next week, but 2 weeks. Enjoy your turkeys. Enjoy your korbanot, your sacrifices and your turkeys. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Anybody interested in the study group? I have 3 more artists visiting with us this Saturday at 1. So
Thank you.
join us. It's our last session.
Yeah, Rona, it's been a great program.
Yeah, well, and Rabbi Gelman's going to offer it as a class, I think, at the J. So I'll be able to do some of the artists who won't do Saturday.
That's super.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to it. I just turned in the proposal formal. So
Okay, great.
I will see you Saturday.
Yeah, God willing. Shabbat
Yeah.
shalom.
Bye.
Bye-bye.